Today we are in part 3 of this series we've been doing called Marriage Evaluation, okay? And this whole concept, just to kind of rewind and come forward, because I know some of you guys haven't been here for all of them. The concept in this is that the word evaluate means to find the value of, the proper value of. And we think that it's important that we put the proper value on marriage. The reason why this is so important is because we believe that God has one evaluation, what he considers the value of marriage, and that our culture has a different evaluation, that they're not the same. That culture, we believe, has kind of slid into this low evaluation of marriage, not really considering it to be very valuable, and that God speaks of marriage as though it has this extremely high value in our lives. The reason why this is important? Every single one of you are going to decide what your evaluation of marriage is. Do you lean more towards culture's evaluation of marriage, or do you believe God's evaluation of marriage? Because those two different evaluations will take you in two completely different directions with your marriage or your future marriage, whatever the situation is. We said this, and we believe this is true. The distance between your evaluation of marriage and God's evaluation of marriage is going to be the determining factor for the success of your marriage. However far you are off from what God says marriage is, that's what we think is going to create the issues in them. So today we're actually going to be talking all about married couples, okay? So if anybody who's married out there, can you proudly throw your hand over your head if you're married? This is awesome, okay? Today I'm going to be talking to you, Amy's going to be talking to you, but if you are pre-marriage or if you're post-marriage, there is still tons of valuable information in this. Do not check out at all because this is critical for you as well. Today we want to talk about how you can appreciate your marriage. And actually that word appreciate has two different definitions. The first is the one you use it most, which means basically like to say like that you recognize the value of something, right? Like, oh, I appreciate you. And you're saying, I recognize your value. But there's a second definition for the word appreciate, which is to increase in value. Right? Things can depreciate, go down in value, but also if you invest in something that's valuable, like say like a classic collector car, over the years they can say, actually this car is appreciated, it's gone up in value. And that's really our hope today. Not just that you would recognize the value of your marriage, that you could add value to your marriage. We really do believe that it's the case. We believe that any couple can appreciate their marriage, can add value to it, and that marriage is not a fixed value system. It can consistently be changed either for the worse or for the better. Now, culture, because of their kind of recognition of marriage and what culture in general thinks of marriage, okay, this low evaluation, what I have found is that I believe that culture tends to coast when it comes to marriage. Culture tends to coast, right? There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of excitement when marriages begin, but then what happens is marriages just kind of and just coast off. It's like the energy stops going into it, and you'll just kind of see marriages that just kind of turn into two people who end up living together, but there's not really any passion, or it just kind of tapers off to this other situation, and then sooner or later, a lot of them end. But we who believe God's evaluation of marriage believe that marriage is of this extremely high value. So I would say this, if you believe God's evaluation of marriage, you don't have the right to coast in marriage. You're actually meant to work at marriage, to consistently try to add value to it. Where culture says marriage is this contract between two people, we, of course, who are believing God's evaluation, say that it's actually this covenant and God's involved with it, and we have a responsibility to God to add value into it. So we believe that Christians are supposed to maintain or even improve their marriage throughout their life, that it shouldn't be static, it shouldn't coast, it should actually get better and better throughout the years. I believe Christians should have the best marriages on planet Earth. That should be one of the things that we're known for in the world. And here's our main idea, and then Amy will jump in and start taking us from here. Your marriage will only be as valuable as how much you put into it. Your marriage will only be as valuable as how much you put into it. So how could we add some value, Amy?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about 3 areas today that we think can add value to your marriage. And so the first area that we believe can add value is serving. Now, this idea of serving your spouse is like a countercultural idea. You know, we don't really think about that, talk about that a lot. And just the idea of serving people in general is, and it's not just now, when Jesus was around 2,000 years ago, even this idea was countercultural. And so this is what Jesus says about this in Matthew 20, 25 through 28. But Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many." So Jesus said, this world has one way of doing it. In this world, we love to be served. We love to kind of prop ourselves up, and the more people who serve you, kind of the higher up you get. And we lord our authority over people. But Jesus said, among you it will be different. And the same is true for our marriages. The world has one way of doing marriage, and with us, it's going to be different. So in culture, a lot of times it's popular to stay in our marriage as long as it makes us happy, or as long as it serves us. And as soon as, it doesn't serve us, we might want out. We might not be happy anymore. But when Jesus came to the earth, he came to serve. He made himself a servant, and we're called to do the same thing. We're called to serve others in the way that Jesus did. And of course, this is a call for all of us as Christians, just as Jesus followers. This is our call, that we are to serve other people, to not just think of ourselves, to make ourselves a servant. But the first area that we can start to apply this is our marriage. And the easiest place we can start to live this out is in our marriage, in serving our spouse. So when we focus on serving in our marriages, it's going to transform them. It's going to make them stand out from those in our culture. It'll transform our marriages to make them look different than those who don't focus on this. So we believe that generous service is the mark of a Christian marriage. And another great example that Jesus gave us on this, he gave us an example on how to serve in the upper room with his disciples. And this takes place in John 13. And Jesus starts to do something that was really unusual, really shocking at the time. He stands up, takes off his robe, grabs a bucket of water, and begins to wash the feet of the disciples. And Peter even says, no, you're never going to wash my feet. And he kind of rejects out of love and respect for Jesus, because he doesn't want him washing his feet. That's his Lord. But Jesus, he says, no, I have to do this. He washes his feet. And if you can just put this picture in your head of Jesus, our Savior, we believe King of Kings, most worthy King, on his hands and knees, just scrubbing the dirty feet of these men who would go on to deny him and betray him. So we're going to read a part of this story in John 13. In verse 12, it says, "After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down and asked, 'Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you.'" So this Jesus did specifically to give us an example on how to serve. And so we're going to figure out a couple things that Jesus did, a couple things that stand out about the example he gave us. So first and foremost, Jesus made himself a servant. Jesus wasn't the one being served. He was the one down on his knees washing everyone else's feet. Even though he had every right to be served, he decided to be the one who's doing the serving. He humbled himself and he served those around him. And that's the same thing in our marriage. We make ourselves a servant, not our spouse. We can't control if they are a servant. We make ourselves a servant, and we serve our spouse. Jesus didn't serve because the disciples deserved it. He didn't distinguish who was worthy and who wasn't worthy of his service. He washed the feet of Peter, who just a few hours later was going to say he didn't even know Jesus. He washed the feet of Judas, who would obviously go on to betray him. So Jesus didn't serve based on whether the person was worthy of his service or not, because they most definitely weren't. So we don't serve our spouse based on them being worthy. Whether they deserve it or not is not something that we consider when we serve our spouse. Jesus served without getting anything in return. If you notice in the story, Jesus doesn't finish up and say, all right, who's washing mine now? He just serves freely. He just gives with no strings attached, not expecting anything in return. And in our marriage, we have to throw away that question of what's in it for me when we think about serving our spouse. Instead of looking at our marriages as this give and take situation, I give some stuff to you, you give some stuff to me, we have to look at marriage as a I give because I love you situation, and that's it, not because I get anything back in return. And lastly, Jesus did this with the right attitude. Do you think that when Jesus washed Peter's feet that he was like huffing and puffing and like, thinking about like, this guy's gonna deny me in a couple hours? Or do you think like when he got to Judas, he like twisted his ankle a little bit, like just to, No, of course not. Jesus had the right attitude when he served. And we need to as well. We're not just after the actions that Jesus did, we're after his attitude as well. We want to have a spirit of service when we serve our spouse. So this is literally the example that Jesus gave us to follow. Now, if I went on to say, now wives, when you go home, I want you to get on your knees and I want you to scrub your husband's feet and just wash them. I think some of you would probably be offended at that. Like you would think, that's demeaning. I'm not going to get down and wash his feet. That's gross. But this is the picture that Jesus gave us. That's what shows you like, wow, that's such a humble, low place to put yourself, to elevate the other person, to lower yourself, to do something like that. And if you put it into those terms and think about actually doing it, it makes the picture so much more real. And obviously the same goes for husbands and wives. That's the picture that we're given just to serve each other.
Yeah, and I would say if that picture offends you to put yourself in that, but it didn't offend you to hear Jesus did that, it just means you're prideful. It didn't offend you when Jesus did it, but it offended you when you would do it, then that just means that's your pride rearing up.
Right, and that's just, I think that's just the power in the example that Jesus gave us when we actually think about doing it and doing it to those around us. That's the posture that Jesus had when he served. So we believe that the more two people serve in marriage, the more valuable the marriage becomes. So serving focuses on the other person's need. And Jesus was serving a need in the moment. The disciples, were walking around all day. They wore sandals, and their feet were always super dusty. So that was a common thing that they did. A common custom was to wash feet. And so Jesus was serving a need. So what does your spouse need? Our goal is to serve them with what they need. We don't just serve in a way that, we would want to be served that way, so we're going to serve them in the way we think. We serve them with what they need.
And I think that's good because that's that idea, like you said, not just doing what you think, but what they really need. I mean, this is a silly example, but it's totally true, okay? In our house, we are a divided house when it comes to peanut butter and jelly, okay? This is serious, okay? Amy thinks it's okay to make peanut butter and jelly with strawberry jelly, okay?
It's better.
I know that you're supposed to use grape jelly, okay? So, but every time I go to make myself a peanut butter and jelly, or every time Amy makes me a peanut butter and jelly, sure enough, when I open it up, it's grape jelly. She buys grape jelly and puts it in there. She's the one who does all the shopping. She doesn't just buy strawberry jelly and be like, suck it up, right? I got you jelly, be happy. She still buys me the grape jelly because she knows that's what I like, right?
I buy you Miracle Whip too.
It's true, we're divided on that. I'm a Miracle Whip and she's a mayonnaise person. So yeah, she still buys me Miracle Whip.
Right, so I don't make you a strawberry peanut butter and jelly,
Right.
Even though I know that's better. I give it the way he likes it. So it's all about serving the other person's need. What do they need? Meeting those needs. Also, it's really important to know how your spouse receives love if we want to serve them well, to serve them in a way that they feel loved. If you're familiar with that concept of the 5 love languages, that all of us have a way that we receive love. It's either physical touch, words of affirmation, gifts, quality time, or acts of service. And so my love language, the way I receive love, is through words and through time. And Cameron is physical touch. So if I try to just serve him in the way that I feel loved, if I just try to tell him I love him and spend time, because that's what I like, that's not actually serving him, because that's not actually how he receives love. It's not going to accomplish the purpose I want it to. I know that if I want to serve him and I want to make him feel loved, I have to hug him and I have to show him physical affection, because that's the way he receives love. So we have to recognize what our spouse needs and how they receive love, and then commit to serving them in that way.
Yeah, and that's good. That's a great way to add value. The idea of serving. The more each of us become servants, the more value we add. The next area where we think that we can add value to our marriage, or we can increase the value of it, is through sexual intimacy, okay? And we said kind of last week when we talked about this whole idea of pre-marriage and the idea of, oh, you have to have sex before you're married to know if you're compatible. We kind of said mockingly, right, like it's such a small portion of your marriage by time. And that is absolutely true, for sure. You spend way more time being friends, doing the other parts together. But it is important to recognize that sex really is the defining characteristic of marriage, right? Basically, it's the one area in our relationship, the one need that we have that cannot be satisfied by anyone else. It can't be supplemented by anyone else, that we're the ones who fulfill that. Really, that's the one truly monogamous area of a marriage that exists, right? And we believe that sex is a gift from God. It's a gift in order to create intimacy between the husband and wife inside of a marriage covenant. And that being said, this is important because when sometimes people start thinking about God and they're like, ew, like you hear about sex, and some of you you're weirded out or tensed up right now just hearing this. There's no shame in conversation about sex inside of the marriage covenant. It's important that we distinguish that. Sure, there's a lot of ways we can misuse sex, but inside the marriage covenant, there's no shame inside of that. I mean, just make sure you understand this. If you're married, when you go in the bedroom, God doesn't turn the other way, okay? Like he's not embarrassed by anything that's happening. He designed your body. He designed us to be able to come together in that way. I mean, just if you need any reference, go back in the Old Testament, read this book called the Song of Solomon, okay? It is downright steamy in some places, okay? And it is not talking about how beautiful sex is and it procreates and makes a baby. It's talking about the physical pleasure of it, okay? And it's the story of this young man and this young wife, this young couple together. And it's obvious that God designed it to be that way in regards to it. We believe that God did it on purpose because it's meant to create intimacy between a married couple. In fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians, where we're reading all about the whole idea of being married or being single, he speaks specifically to this. I want to read this to you. 1 Corinthians 7, 3-5. He says this: the husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's sexual needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so that you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, I believe what Paul was saying this is he was talking about this because he wanted to add value to marriages in this situation. And Paul really speaks to two specific areas in regards to this. The first is that he talks about how sex is meant to be exclusive. It's meant to be an exclusive act between the husband and wife. He says basically the husband is supposed to find exclusively in his wife his sexual satisfaction, and the wife is supposed to find exclusively in her husband her sexual satisfaction. In fact, really, as we look through God's word, if you study it from beginning to end, you'll recognize that God really has no concern about what goes on in the bedroom. His concern is who is in the bedroom. That's what he concerns himself with. He's not really concerned about what goes on in the bedroom. He's concerned about who is there experiencing that together. That what he always speaks of is the idea that it's only meant to be the husband and wife alone in covenant in this relationship. One of the ways that I say this is there is no room in your bed or in your head for someone else other than who you're married to, okay? There is no room in your bed and there's no room in your head for anyone else other than the person who you decide to marry. They are supposed to fulfill all of your sexual needs. And this exclusivity, the idea that we're meant to satisfy each other's needs completely, is what adds this deep intimacy into marriage because it's just us. It's just her, it's just him, and they're the person who are looking to satisfy these desires. The other thing that Paul points to is the idea that sex is meant to be consistent. He specifically talks about this. He warns at the danger of taking breaks from our sexual intimacy, right? He says, don't deprive each other of the idea of being separated for a period, but coming back together so that Satan couldn't tempt, that there is a danger when it becomes inconsistent. That first statement, do not deprive each other. So interesting. In the original Greek, where the way that that's translated, it would translate to this: do not rob or steal from each other this opportunity. Don't rob or steal. Well, I think that's fascinating because the whole thing we're talking about is how we believe we can add value to our marriage. And Paul says this is a way you can steal value from your marriage. You can steal value from your marriage by depriving your spouse of their sexual needs inside of the marriage. We want to add value to it, and that's why we think that sexual intimacy is one of these ways that we can add into it. Now, this doesn't mean that there's never a no. People will try to misuse this situation and to contort it into something that it's not meant to be, but I will say this, no shouldn't be the most common answer, right? He's saying that we shouldn't be depriving each other. It's not that there can't ever be a no, but that shouldn't be the standard. The standard should be that we're finding a good rhythm of sexual intimacy that is serving both partners' needs. The idea is that we don't go into the area of deprivation, as he says. To deprive is to take away what somebody needs, to deprive of water, to deprive of oxygen, those things that are deadly to us. So it's not that the sex life needs to meet every single one of our desires, but it is important it's meeting our needs. It's not that we can't, like, every single time we desire that there's not met by satisfaction, but certainly the idea that there is a need inside of us for sexual intimacy as husband and wife, and that we're meeting those needs. It's so important. We believe that one of the ways this adds value to marriage is that sexual intimacy is like a reset button on the marriage. It's like a reset button. Here's what I mean, okay? No one wants to have sex with their spouse when they're angry, annoyed, frustrated, and can't stand them. Nobody does. Like, that's not what happens. The person has annoyed you, the person disrespected you, whatever that situation is. Nobody wants then to have sexual intimacy. So what I mean is this. Whatever your rhythm of sexual intimacy is, that is about the time frame it's going to force you to have a fight, to have a conversation, to make a solution. I'll say it this way, okay? The length of time between sexual intimacy in your marriage will decide the length of time you can remain bitter with your spouse. The length of time between sexual intimacy will decide the length of time you can remain bitter with your spouse. Because whatever it is that we have to solve it in order to come back together and to have this sexual intimacy again. So again, we believe that consistent sexual intimacy inside of the covenant marriage, don't try to apply this before the covenant marriage, it doesn't work, inside the covenant marriage will actually add value to it. So, just for reference, for any of you out there, the next time, you may be a little interested, you just lean over and say, hey, stud, or hey, babe, what do you say we go add some value to this marriage, right? Go add a little value to it. Maybe.
So this is an area.
It just keeps getting funnier the more you think about it, doesn't it?
All right. So this is an area that tends to coast in our marriages, right? Because the common joke in our culture is that the longer you're married, what happens? You never have sex. That's just the common joke in our culture. So, but we believe that this area really does add value to our marriages.
Right.
And we want to be sure we think about it the right way because we're talking about sexual intimacy and we're saying it that way on purpose.
Yes.
Because you can have sex without intimacy and you can have intimacy without sex.
Correct.
But we want both in our marriages. That is what we're after. And like you said, it's so important because it forces us to come together. It forces us not to stay mad at each other. And it not only has physical benefits, but it has emotional benefits as well. It's the way God created it, the picture of two becoming one, and that it binds us together. Yeah. And it just has emotional benefits where after you have sex, you just feel closer. That's just how it is. It has emotional benefits to make you feel secure. So, you might think, well, what is a healthy rhythm? Like, how many times, whatever, like, what should we strive for? And we would just say, how much value do you want to add to your marriage? Like, the more can only be better. You're only going to add more value into it. So
the best message ever for someone out there. They're like, we're coming to this church every weekend from now on.
So these areas intertwine as well. We're talking about serving and we're talking about sexual intimacy, but you can serve your spouse in this area of sexual intimacy. So Paul says, like in that verse, it says the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The husband should fulfill his wife's needs. So it's important to recognize what are your spouse's sexual needs. How often do they need to feel loved and cared for? And obviously this changes from season to season, whatever season you're in, whatever changes from couple to couple. Certainly, our rhythm is not the same when we first got married to when we have 3 kids under the age of 4, and it's not going to be the same when you're empty nesters. It changes. It's different for everybody. But I love something that Cameron tells pre-marriage couples, and he says about like finding your right rhythm. He says, the amount that you have sex should be more than the person who wants it the least and less than the person who wants it the most. So just meeting in the middle, considering each other's needs and finding that balance. And when we talk about sexual needs, your wife's sexual needs might not even be something that happens in the bedroom. Like your wife's sexual needs might be that you need to do the dishes before you come to bed so she can just get that out of her mind and focus on trying to become intimate. Or her needs might be that you put the kids to bed so she has a minute to relax. We're talking about something bigger than what goes on just in the bedroom.
That's good.
And so it might not really be something even sexual, but maybe you need to send your husband a text earlier on in the day just to tell him, I'm thinking about you, I appreciate you, something like that.
Yeah, the goal to create that intimacy.
Right. So we truly believe in this area, as service in general, it's better to give than to receive. So if we focus on giving in this area rather than what can we get from this area, it's going to change the whole dynamic of it. So we can add value to our marriages in the area of serving, in the area of sexual intimacy. And then lastly, the area we can add value to our marriage is in submitting.
Yeah, and submitting is another one of those words where, to be honest with you, in our culture, it kind of sounds like it's an unhealthy or negative word, right? But it's a very, very biblical word that we have to grasp if we are believing that God is the designer of this, that God has this evaluation of marriage. I want to read for you in Ephesians 5, 21 through 25. It talks about this issue. Paul says this, and further, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And just to pause there for a second, this is a statement about us in the broad view of us being part of like this church community. You have people around you, your friends, your family, the people who are in your church around you. And he says, you're actually supposed to submit yourself to each other. The idea of this is not just thinking of yourself as number one and most important. It's this concept of yielding in a healthy way, of sometimes putting your needs second in a healthy way and saying, how can I serve someone else instead of just always being about me? And then what's interesting is Paul kind of goes from this general principle of all of us and brings it down specifics into marriage. He says this as he continues. For wives, this means submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For a husband is the head of his wife as Christ is the head of the church. He is the Savior of his body, the church. As the church submits to Christ, so you wives should submit to your husbands in everything. For husbands, this means love your wives, just as Christ loved the church. He gave up his life for her. Now, there's 2 different pieces to this. And again, this is important if we believe what we talked about in week 1, that marriage is not just 2 people agreeing to be together, but it's a covenant, and that we're actually supposed to represent the relationship of Jesus and the church with our marriage. If you didn't listen to week 1, you got to go back and listen to it, not only to understand things like this, but also we gave you the one warning at week 1 of the fact that we would be offensive. So now if you're in this and you're like, I'm getting really offended, go back and listen to week 1 because we covered that in week 1. We just don't have time for it today. But it says this, the wives, they're called to submit. And that word submission, here's what I think submission looks like inside of the marriage. It looks like respect. It looks like respect. Notice how God reminds the couple that he instituted this order in marriage, okay? That men have a responsibility of headship. And this is really important. In another section, it basically says that men are the head of women, that Christ is the head over man, that God is the head over Christ. This is obviously not an order of value because we couldn't say that Jesus is less valuable than God. It's an order of responsibility. And this is what we really do believe, okay? This is completely countercultural. We really do believe men and women are different, and we believe men, you have an added responsibility inside the marriage. You have an added responsibility from God that wives are not really held accountable for their husband's faith, but husbands, you are held accountable for your wife's faith. That there is an issue of leadership and authority that you are supposed to take on, and you are supposed to try to lead your family, that God instituted that order on purpose. And it's interesting because he basically says, the picture of this is the whole relationship of us with God. He says, it really isn't that hard. For wives, if you're wondering, what could this possibly look like? He says, when we think about this respect, think about kind of how you respect Jesus. He says, kind of like you respect Jesus, right? Think about it. You trust Jesus' leadership. You want to bring honor to him. You want him to be known as honorable in your life. You're not just working to make yourself famous in your life. You're working to make Jesus famous. This is the call for all of us. And he says the same kind of situation for you as wives. This respect kind of looks like this idea of trusting your husband's leadership, building him up as a man, trying to bring honor to him. The idea that you don't just want to make yourself great and bring down your husband. You want other people to recognize what a great man your husband is and to kind of be this support to your husband. I know this is definitely true, and I think there's a reason why God spoke this, because I know it's the truth with Amy and I, okay? Her response to me, her evaluation of me means more than everyone else. If everybody else tells me I'm doing great, but I can feel from Amy that I'm doing bad, I'm doing bad, okay? If everyone else is telling me that you're awful and is throwing these insults and these rocks at me, but Amy's saying, no, you're a good man, I feel like a good man. There's this issue of submission and kind of this respect that comes from a wife that makes a man great. I totally believe that idea. They say behind every great man is a great woman. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's something inside of that that's critical. And he says, wives, this is kind of your awesome calling in submission of how you can submit inside the relationship. And then husbands, it says this, your call is to love. Now, love is just a nebulous word, but I think the picture they use is so perfect because this love, it looks like sacrifice. Sacrifice. Notice it says that you're supposed to love your wives like Jesus loved the church, and the very next line is he gave up his life for her. He sacrificed in order to make her pure. Think about this. It's so cool. How the marriage is supposed to look if we're actually healthy. The wife submits and places her husband first. Says, I believe you and I trust you. And then get this, with this place of headship and authority, the husband uses it not to bless himself, but to bless his wife first. He sacrifices. She says, I trust you. And he says, and I sacrifice to make you have an amazing life. I sacrifice to make sure your needs are cared for. It's this beautiful circle that's meant to take place. That husbands, we are called to seek what is best for our wives above our own needs. Some of you understand this because you're the guy, right, where you're like, if my wife was ever in trouble, I would step in front of a bullet. I would lay down my life for her. And that is absolutely your call as a husband. Yes, that is your call as a husband, to sacrifice if necessary, to rescue her and stand in that gap. That's a call for us as men. But also not just to die for our wives, but to live for our wives. Maybe that one's actually harder, right? To sacrifice daily, not once with our life, but to sacrifice our desires, our needs, our time, our money, the things that we think are so valuable to us, and say the first thing that these things of me are going to serve is her needs and then mine. I sacrifice like Jesus sacrificed at a cost to himself to make the church great. And I do the very same for my wives. Like I said, it's a circle where she submits and he blesses sacrificially. Because we believe that our marriages are actually not just supposed to be us two together making each other happy, but instead representing Jesus, us taking these two different roles and living them out is going to be this picture of Jesus in the church. But not only that, actually, this is what's so cool about God. We believe it's not just that he called us to do this to be able to represent the church. We believe that he understood this would actually bring the greatest blessing to our relationship if we trusted him in it.
Right. So I want to read that last verse in that chapter. It's Ephesians 5:33. And it says, so again I say, each man must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. So this is the last verse in that chapter. Even from that passage you read, it's just under that. And so Paul is saying, again, I'm saying this. So he's saying, like, I'm saying the same thing. He's just saying it a little bit differently. He's just rephrasing it and saying that men, you're called to love your wives, and women, you are called to respect your husband. And this is a life-changing concept in our marriages because we don't just believe that this is like a wise instruction that Paul gave us, that this is something smart that we should do in our marriages. We actually believe that this is how God designed us as husband and wives, as men and women, that we both need respect and love.
Yes.
All of us need respect and love. But we believe that men specifically need a higher dose of respect and women need a higher dose of love. We believe that this is really how God made us. And if you've ever read or heard of the book Love and Respect by Emerson Eggerichs, that's kind of the whole concept of the book about this concept that goes really far into it. It could be really helpful for you if you're looking for something like that. But they propose the idea in the book that all problems in our marriages really come back to the issue of a lack of respect or a lack of love. And we can get in this cycle as married couples that I act disrespectful because I feel unloved, and so he acts unloving because he feels disrespected, and it becomes just this cycle that keeps going and going because we keep kind of withholding what each other needs and giving what the other person doesn't want. So it's important for us to distinguish, too, that love and respect are not the same things. You might think, well, it's kind of the same. It's not. And one example of this, kind of like to put it in your mind, is think of your boss, like at work. You might respect your boss. That doesn't mean you love them. You might respect them, but those feelings of love aren't there. So they're two different things that we're talking about. But even a step further from that, Paul is introducing this concept of unconditional love and unconditional respect. I don't know if you noticed, but Paul didn't put any clarifiers on the end there. You know, he didn't say, women, you should respect your husband if he deserves it. Or men, you should love your wives if she's in a good mood. It's just unconditional love and respect. We aren't given any clarifiers with that. We're called to give unconditional love and unconditional respect to each other, and we really believe that that's what we need. And I think it's a little bit easier for us to grasp that picture of unconditional love, that picture of a husband loving his wife and sacrificing. That's kind of a picture that we can put in our minds. But respect and that idea of unconditional respect, I think, can be harder for us to grasp. Like, what does that look like practically in a marriage? And respect might be hard for us to picture, but we know what disrespect is, right? So I think that we can start by not disrespecting and go from there. Take away the disrespect and then work on respecting. I think a lot of times in marriages, especially us as women, we underestimate the power of body language, of our tone, of our complaining and our bad attitudes, and the effect that it can have in our marriages. There's this marriage counselor one time that said that he had a trick to tell whether the couple was going to heal their marriage in counseling or whether they were going to get divorced. He had a way of telling from the very first session. He said, if this happens, I know if they're going to get divorced or not. And it worked like 95% of the time. And this sign was that if the wife rolled her eyes at her husband in the first session, they were going to get divorced. Something so small can tell you so much. And I think we underestimate the power that that has in our marriages. So we can start by not disrespecting and then go on from there on ways to actively show our husbands and our wives what they need. So actively showing ways of respect, actively showing ways of love to each other. So if you feel like stuck in your marriage, if you feel like you might be in this cycle, somebody has to break the cycle. You can be that person to break the cycle. You can decide, I'm going to be that person. And it goes back to that picture of Jesus putting himself below, not because the other person deserved it, but putting himself below, humbling himself to serve the other person and saying, I'm going to give you what you need, even though I don't feel like it, even though you don't deserve it. I'm going to give you what you need, even though I feel that way. I'm going to humble myself, and I'm going to serve you. I'm going to put your needs above mine, and I'm going to give you what you know you need.
Yeah, because again, this idea comes back to, do you want to add value to your marriage? You could just stay where it's at, and you could keep yourself there. But this idea of service, right, it adds value. The idea of pursuing sexual intimacy can add value into the marriage. The idea then of submitting, it can add value into the marriage. We believe that your marriage will only be as valuable as how much you basically are willing to put into it. That's it. Culture, as we said, they have this tendency to coast when it comes to marriage. When it comes to the value of marriage, sure, everything's romantic, everything is exciting, and then it gets into it, and it just coasts from there. But if you actually believe God's evaluation of marriage, okay, the idea that marriage is of this tremendous value, we talked about, not just the idea of two people making each other happy, but God using it as a tool to make us holy, right? Not just the idea of two people being together, but a covenant where we're actually displaying the image of Christ and his church. All this much higher evaluation, then you are called to work at this. You're called to think, how can I add value to it? How can I add something to it, make it better and better and better? Because again, your marriage will only be as valuable as how much you're willing to put into it. So I would ask you this question: are you appreciating your marriage? Are you actively adding value to it? Are you working at it, or are you just coasting? Have you kind of just fallen in line with what this world kind of says about marriage, and you've just been kind of staying married, but you're not adding value to it, right? For some of you, you guys are pre-marriage, okay? You are not married yet. You might be in a relationship with somebody, or you might not even have found that person yet, but you're thinking about marriage coming up. And this is really important for you to grasp right here, right now, because this is what you are looking for in marriage. I need you, if you are single and you are thinking about getting married, to recognize marriage is not the finish line, marriage is the starting line. Okay? Starting line of this process. This is one of the reasons why I would say, men or women, okay, when you find that person and you start dating and you start thinking about marriage, ask yourself this question: are they a person who can do some hard work? Because marriage is going to be hard work for the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Or are they just going to coast? Because it's not going to work. For some of you, you're married, but maybe, to be honest with you, you've just been coasting. You haven't been thinking about this, okay? That could be the fact that marriage still feels good. That's fine. It could still feel good. Or it could have coasted into something that kind of feels dull compared to what it used to be, okay? Today, you need to decide that you are going to start adding value into this. Sure, I think there's probably room for a conversation with your spouse, but I kind of like what Amy was saying about the idea of submitting and serving. Really, you don't even need to start by having a conversation. You can just start adding value to your marriage right now, even if your spouse isn't on board. If they're not interested, they're not here, you can still start adding value to it, and then maybe that conversation can come along as you continue on. That you can bring service, that you can end up submitting, that you can try to serve sexually as far as their needs and intimacy, and try to build more intimacy in the relationship that might have been broken and might have been falling apart, that you can add value to it. And then last, okay, you might be the person who, as we're talking about this today, you just kind of have this feeling of heartbreak because you feel like this is all too late. It's already over. The value is gone. There's nothing left to add to. It's broken. It's over, right? And if that's the case of where you're at today, I plead with you, I beg you, please come back next week, because next week we are going to talk about what do you do when there is no value left in marriage. Is there any hope, or is it just over? Because we wholeheartedly believe this is important if you're in that season, or even if you're not in that season yet, to grasp this idea, because it could be a game changer for your marriage. Amy, would you pray for us as we end?
Yes. God, we thank you so much for this time and just for the things that you're speaking to us in our spirit right now, the things that you're bringing to mind and leading us towards, God. We just believe what you have to say about marriage, that you created it, that it has a high value, God. Would you help us to act accordingly, to act like our marriages have high value? God, would you help us to humble ourselves, serve our spouses, to put them first? Help us to follow the example that Jesus gave us. Help us to serve more, give more. Would you give us the attitude of Jesus as we serve each other? And I just pray for any marriages right now that are struggling. I pray that you would breathe new life into them, God. I pray for any marriages who have coasted. I pray that you would re-energize us, God. Give us a new vision for what marriage could be. God, we just recommit ourselves to each other, and we ask for your help and your strength. God, I just pray that you would make our marriages more valuable than ever before. God, that as we walk in this attitude of service and thinking of the other person, that you would bless our marriages, you would make them better than ever before. And we thank you for everything you're doing in us. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.